Theology Unplugged.
Hey guys, Michael Patton here, Theology Unplugged. Thanks for joining me. Humor me here for a little bit as I take a detour from some of the stuff we're doing. So as you know, I usually go through big picture type stuff. Like we're still going through theology in a year. So join us here if you want to go through theology in a year. That's what we've been doing. We're up to 67, session 67. It's taking me a lot longer to prepare this session than I thought. But I'm going to talk about something today, just for a minute. It's not going to take long. Because it's been going around the internet quite a bit, especially around YouTube. You got the YouTubeosphere that many people are on, and you'll the algorithm will pick up certain things, and it's picked up for me over and over again this stuff going on with Wesley Huff and what he said about the Old Testament on the Joe Rogan show. But just a minute, it's really exciting what God is doing with so many people. I don't know if you've noticed it, you probably have, but having Wesley Huff on Joe Rogan, and Mel Gibson came on right after that. Joe Rogan's one of the most influential people in the world, not just podcasts, but people. And to see him move from where he was at years ago, very antagonistic towards Christianity, dismissive, kind of just laughed at anybody who believed in it, thought they were ridiculous, to now where he is seriously considering this stuff in a different way. I don't know where he's at spiritually, but it seems like he is changing. He's at least very open, and I don't see people opening up in a very real sense outside the power of the Spirit. So something's going on, and I just pray that God does change him. I like the guy. He's good. I don't listen to him that much, but I do, especially whenever there's somebody I know or a subject I want to hear about. But he had a guy named Wesley Huff. A lot of you may have heard of it or have maybe seen it. If you haven't, check it out. Joe Rogan and Wes Huff. I didn't know Wes Huff. Kind of embarrassed to admit it, I guess, because it seems like a lot of people do. But he kind of exploded or came onto my picture because he had a debate with a guy named Billy Carson. And I don't know who that is either. Billy Carson, I guess, is a popular guy that seems to be very influential in maybe the world of science. I probably should check it out a little bit more and see what he's known for. He doesn't seem to be too popular anymore because of this debate, and it kind of got shut down. And I watched the debate that Joe Rogan had Wesley Huff on because he supposedly destroyed this guy named Billy Carson so much. And he did. I mean, you watched the debate, and it was a very sad thing. I couldn't believe the stuff that this guy Billy Carson was saying. And I was like, who is this guy? Why is he even debating him? He can't be authoritative in this area because everything he's saying is so, it was comically wrong. But anyway, Wesley Huff debated him, and it became something that was quite an explosion on the internet. Everybody saw it. This guy, Billy Carson, who was very well known in one area, I guess science, had kind of moved over to another area, and that was ancient religions, ancient Christianity, and supposedly kind of some manuscripts of the Bible. And so he was talking about a certain manuscript in the Old Testament, or the certain manuscript that is that dates around 350. You may have heard me talk about it a lot. I've actually got pages of the manuscript here, but it's Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus. He was talking about Codex Sinaiticus, and he said, Billy Carson said this to Wes Huff. He said, the Sinai Bible, and that really threw me too. I was like, well, what is this? Some new book that was written, like the Da Vinci Code, called the Sinai Bible. But anyway, it ended up being what's called Codex Sinaiticus. And Sinaiticus is a very well preserved manuscript of the entire Bible, or almost the entire Bible. No, I think it is the entire Bible. That particular one is the entire Bible, but that we found around, it goes all the way back to 350 or so. We'll talk about that later. We're coming up on that through Theology in a Year, because we're going to have to deal with textual criticism and the history of the Bible. It's going to be a blast. Trust me, it'll be so much fun. But he was talking about this and said something like Jesus didn't rise from the grave in the Sinai Bible, Codex Sinaiticus. And, Wesley Huff was like, are you talking about the same thing as me? And refers to Codex Sinaiticus. He says, is that what you're talking about? And the guy said, yeah. He's like confused, looking at him saying, well, that's simply not true, and showed him, a book that he has that is a facsimile book, not as good as my facsimiles because mine are real, but it was a book that had all of Codex Sinaiticus in there. And he said, it does talk about the resurrection of Christ, most definitely. And so the guy, kind of moved on to something else and something else. He ended up Billy Carson, he shouldn't have been talking about this stuff. You don't talk about stuff you don't know like that, especially in an authoritative way. But he ended up getting really just run over by Alex. Alex was a nice guy, too. He wasn't like belittling him or anything. And he seems to be a well-rounded defender of the gospel. So this got out around the internet that Billy Carson got destroyed by this guy named Alex Huff. And so somehow Joe Rogan heard about it and said, and watched it. And he said, hey, I'm going to have this guy on. So he had Wesley Huff on Joe Rogan. It was incredible. It really was. Because this is the first time I've seen that he has had somebody that really, really knew their stuff about Christianity and this particular area of New Testament manuscripts. And so he was well able to talk about this, but at the same time, he was a scholar that yet at the same time very evangelical, very much wanting Joe Rogan to know about Christ. And so throughout the time they talked about it, he explained to him the history of the Bible, and at the end he did give him the gospel very clearly. It was great. I was praying for it. I was praying for him, even though I saw it afterwards. I was praying, please God, let him share the gospel and share it well. And he did. And here we are, on Joe Rogan's show, getting a clear presentation of the gospel. And like I said, Mel Gibson did pretty good the next day. Surprised me, telling about the resurrection. He did talk about the Shroud of Turin, which I happen to agree is probably legitimate, yet at the same time, I don't really use it as my centerpiece. Mel Gibson did. But either way, both of them gave him the gospel, and it was great. But Wesley Huff said something during the podcast that was unfortunate. And at one point he was talking about, and his area is not the Old Testament manuscripts, but at one point he was talking about the Old Testament and how well preserved it is. And then they got into the Dead Sea Scrolls and what they mean for the history of the biblical text and for Christianity in general. And it's great to bring up the Dead Sea Scrolls. We'll talk about them as well whenever we get to them in the Through Theology in a Year. But they were tracing back the Bible, and he was trying to help him to understand how well preserved the Bible is. Now, let me pause there, and I'm going to pull over and talk about something else, and we'll get back on this road in just a minute. Whenever I first started studying theology and apologetics, one of the very exciting things that I learned was about the history of the Bible and the manuscripts. That's why, I make all these manuscripts. That's why I have these. I've shown these before. This one here is P52, one of the earliest, if not the earliest fragment of the New Testament that we have, which is a portion of John 18:31 through 33 and 18:37 through 38. But I make these and sell them at credocourses.com. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to give you an example here. But if you did happen to want to have one of these, this one here is the Bodmer Papyri P66. The Bodmer Papyri is a collection. It's a book. It's an ancient book, and this is just the first page in that book, and this is John chapter 1 through 1:17. And I like this because you can show people, where it says in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And maybe you just get to know enough Greek to be able to do that. That would be nice, but you don't have to know Greek, of course. I like this one. This one is P115. This is my newest edition, and the reason why I like this is because it's the earliest fragment of the mark of the beast that we know of, and it dates back very early to the 2nd century, and or to the 3rd century. And as you can see here, no, you can't see. It says at one right there where as the under. Let's see here. Okay, you see the thing that looks like the XIC? That is 616 rather than 666. This particular manuscript, this earliest manuscript we have, has 616. I know I've said that before recently. I just think it's fun. But having said all of that, when we go through the history of the manuscripts, it's very exciting and it's very faith-building if you know what you're talking about, what you're doing. But sometimes, just like in so many areas, we can overstate our case. I think it's our tendency, especially when we're young, new Christians. In our mind, we are wanting to confirm what we believe. We're a little bit afraid that it might be wrong, or we just want to establish it so that we can tell other people about it, and oftentimes we overstate. And I remember learning about the history of the Bible transmission, and I remember the person who told me about this. I remember where I was sitting, everything, because it was so exciting to me. He talked about how the Bible was transmitted from the original authors, then people would copy it, and we have lots and lots of copies. Well, I was told that whenever they copied it, they would have somebody watching over them, and they would do it letter for letter, and they would use different types of pens for what's called the nomina sacra, the name of God, and they would change their clothing even whenever they're writing certain things. It was just it was a perfect process, letter for letter. And if they got something wrong, they would burn the manuscript. And there'd be this many people that check it. And there was a whole list of things they went through whenever they would transcribe the Bible. And then they talk about how whenever you look back at the earliest Bibles that we have that date back to the early centuries of the church or before with the Old Testament, they said because they were so careful, you could look back and see that the Bible was perfect, not one mistake, because they would burn the mistakes. And that was exciting. I mean, I just heard it, and I thought, well, this has got to be true. That makes sense. Maybe God would do this, because why would we have an inspired Bible but not have copies that were perfect and protected by Him? Now, this is called the doctrine of preservation. The doctrine of preservation, very few people hold to that. I don't know anybody really in the evangelical world. There's no real evangelical scholars that hold to this. But the doctrine of preservation says that God inspired the transmission, preserved the Bible in a perfect way. Now, King James only people hold to this. They believe in 1611 that God came and watched over. The Holy Spirit empowered everybody who committee who translated the Greek and Hebrew into the King James in 1611. There's a lot of King James only people out there. They're very militant. Maybe there's not that many, but they're very militant. And basically what they say is if we do not, then they believe the King James is perfect. They believe the King James is the only Bible that we should be using. They would even go so far. I worked for a King James only place in 1998. And as a matter of fact, I would say that I was pretty well convinced of it because I was a young guy. Like I said, I was kind of eating all this stuff up. And if it confirmed my faith, I loved it. And at this point, that confirmed that the Bible we have is perfect. And so I started studying it a lot. And this is whenever I got in to the history of the manuscripts. And it was one of the first deep dive studies I went into. And even so, and whenever I started pulling away from it, I started talking to the people that I worked for, and they were radio personalities that were involved in this. As a matter of fact, it was the longest running Christian radio series at the time. It must still be because I think it's still going. But and I don't want to say who it is because I don't want to demean them in any way. But I began to ask them questions because a lot of things were making my eyebrow raise. And the first thing they would say is that the other Bibles, other than King James, the NI, because we got lots of translations, especially in English. We've got an embarrassment of riches with regard to translations, and that's great. Like right now, I'm going through the Bible in a year, and for the first time, I'm using the Message. So that's a lot of fun, and it's really throwing me for a loop, but I like going through it with the Message. The Message is a paraphrase. It's an English paraphrase, and it is not something that you would look at as a reliable translation if you're looking for word. You've got different kinds of translations. That's a paraphrase. Kind of think of it as paragraph for paragraph. And then you got some of them that are very word for word. Let's go exact word. Every time there's a word, let's try to translate it from the Greek into English. So doesn't matter if it looks kind of funny. Doesn't matter if it's kind of hard to understand. Being faithful to it word for word is the most important. That's word for word. And then you got some that's kind of the middle of the road, which are sentence for sentence. So really you have formal equivalents, and then you got all the way here to dynamic equivalents. That's what they call the spectrum on whenever you're talking about the translation philosophy. And it all has to do with philosophy. People get really bent out of shape about this, and it's one of the most passionate things you'll see out there in theology, people fighting for one translation style over another. I'm just glad we have them all, because people can see the spectrum of ways in which people translate the Bible, and I think it gives you a better understanding of the Bible whenever you see it that way. But anyway, whenever you're looking at this, King James only people look at all these translations, whether it's the NIV, the New American Standard, the ESV, the Revised Standard Version, the New Revised Standard Version, whatever it is, New Living Translation, Message, whatever it is, they would look at that, the King James only people, and say, all of those are not only wrong, but they would say, many of them would say this, they are evil, possibly Satan inspired. That's where I was reading a book at this time. It's called Gail Riplinger, and it was called New Age Bible Versions. And it was basically an argument that all of these other translations were basically from hell. Okay, that would be I guess a nice way to put it. But that's whenever I started raising my eyebrows. And I was like, I know a lot of people that use these, and a lot of these pastors that I listen to that love Christ and that I've learned so much from, they are using other translations. And that's whenever I broke away, started asking questions, and ended up leaving the group. I wasn't there but for about a couple of weeks, maybe, at least in my mind, kind of in this idea that the Bible is preserved perfectly in the King James. But what I was holding to at the time, unbeknownst to me, was the doctrine of preservation, that God has to preserve the Bible perfectly, word for word, in order for us to trust the Bible, the message that he gave us. If he inspired it, why not inspire the transmissions? And so whenever I heard about the people doing this letter for letter and using different types of pen as they're doing it, and changing their clothes, and somebody watching over them, burning it if they mess up. It made sense to me. I was excited about it. But whenever I looked into the history of it and really started studying, I saw that there was times, especially in church history, where there was this that went on, where they did meticulously do letter for letter with people watching them. But those were small times, and yes, the Bible was preserved faithfully there, but it wasn't necessarily that we look at those and those are absolutely perfect. We just from that see how much they believed the Bible and wanted to transmit it accurately. But we've got around 6,000 manuscripts of the New Testament alone that date back before the printing press, and they are very different. Is if you're talking about word for word, letter for letter. It's very hard for anybody to look at these and say that the doctrine of preservation is correct, because we wouldn't know which version, which manuscript to use, because there's mistakes, there's intentional changes, and there's paraphrases type things that people did back then. Just like with our Bibles today, if somebody 2,000 years from now looked back to today and came to my office, they would see 10 or 15 translations. They would say, which one is correct? If I were able to tell them, I'd say they all are to their, you got to understand the way in which things are translated and the way in which the way we understand them. Now, I do not believe in the doctrine of preservation. I do not think we should. I don't think we need to. That's the key. We do not need to believe that the Bible is transmitted perfectly, letter for letter, in order for us to believe the Bible, to submit to the authority of God's Word as we have received it today. There's no reason for us to think that way. As a matter of fact, if we did, we would have to go back to the Greek and Hebrew and say that I have to learn Greek or Hebrew. It's one of the things I asked the people in the King James camp that I worked for. I think it was the last question I asked them was, what about, the manuscripts that came before it that it was translated from? And I was talking about the Byzantine or the majority text. That's the Greek accepted text of 1611 that Erasmus put together based upon about 7 manuscripts in 1517. But that was the accepted one. It had actually gone through a few editions by that time, but that was the accepted one. And I said, why don't you just go back to that? They said the King James, the English King James, actually corrects the Greek and Hebrew behind it. And that's whenever I checked out. I thought, okay, this is not only not necessary for me to believe in my faith, but also it just has no basis in reality. And so, the doctrine of preservation is not something we should hold to, because it's the message of Scripture that is transmitted to us. And the message of Scripture, we could say, is transmitted accurately. We're always looking for manuscripts. We're always excited when we find new, earlier ones. Whenever we find ones that represent that which we hold today, it's exciting for us. And so I think we need to continue with that. But having said that, we don't need word for word. Nobody believes in word for word accuracy whenever it comes to manuscripts. That's why whenever Wesley Huff on Joe Rogan was telling Joe Rogan about the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls in, I believe, 1546. Very exciting time it was, because we found so many. A shepherd boy was out looking for his sheep. I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, but I've read it many times. A shepherd boy was out looking for his sheep, and they go missing in caves sometimes. And where we was at, there's caves everywhere. I mean, all up the mountains and all on the sides. And you know how goats can climb up, crazy how goats can climb up the sides of mountains. But anyway, so he was looking for his sheep, and he started he didn't want to climb up to each one of the caves that were out there. So this is what he would do. He'd pick up rocks and throw them in the caves. He was maybe a slingshot into the cave. And so he was throwing his rocks into all these caves. And whenever he was listening for the sheep to make a noise, he heard pottery break. And so he, curious, goes up there to check and see what's in the cave. And sure enough, he gets in the cave. There's all these vases that have manuscripts in them. And he doesn't know what they are. He doesn't even know how. If he only knew what he found, the guy would be a multi-millionaire right now. But he goes, and it goes eventually to scholars that look at them and say, yeah, these are Bible manuscripts, or some of them are Bible manuscripts. There are all kinds of stuff besides manuscripts. I mean, there's commentaries, there's community notes, there's rules for the community. That was the Dead Sea. It was the Qumran community that kind of had separated from Israel because Israel had been polluted by Romans. Had been polluted, and the temple was polluted. So they said, we're getting out of here. At least in their mind, it was polluted. As long as the Romans were there, we're not going to be here. So a big community of Jews went out to the Dead Sea and was living in Qumran, all these caves. Great stuff we find in there, commentaries and just some really cool stuff we found. I mean, I don't know how many manuscripts, how many different books we found, but it was much, much more than just the Bible. And so, but we did have a lot of Bible manuscripts. I mean, a lot. And there was a really exciting thing because up until that time, we were and we still are. You take, let's see here, my ESV. You take my ESV right here, and you go to the Old Testament, and you say, what is the manuscript that the people who translated the Old Testament here used? What is the Hebrew they used? Was it the Dead Sea Scrolls? I'd say no, it was actually this manuscript called Codex Leningradus, and it dates to the 9th century, 900 years after Christ, and at least 1,300 years after the Old Testament was written. So we had been using not so much a super late manuscript from the standpoint of manuscripts, because manuscripts, you got to see, the finding of manuscripts and understanding how they work is much different. You might look at this and say 1,400 years later, that is so terrible. It wasn't terrible, but it could have been better. So we have manuscripts from, Homer's Iliad that dates 800 years after Homer's Iliad. That's the earliest manuscript of the Iliad we have, which is great and which is fine. And we all read the Iliad and we think it accurately represents what he was trying to say based upon a lot of factors. But here we are, we're using Codex Leningradus, 9th century. This is what we've been using for a long time. It's called the Masoretic text. It was from the people who were following meticulous rules at different times. But anyway, the Masoretic text that we had, Codex Leningradus, dated to the 9th century, 900 years after Christ. Now, at this time, in 1546 or 47, at this time, whenever this shepherd boy found these manuscripts, we go and have them dated, and we find different pieces of the Old Testament. And most importantly, we find a few entire manuscripts of Isaiah, which was incredible. The great Isaiah scrolls. And you look at the Isaiah scrolls and you look, what you want to do at that point is you say, hey, they've got an Old Testament that dates a lot earlier than the Leningradus we have right now. And so let's take that and let's compare what we have been using in the night from Leningrad to these much earlier ones and see how they compare. Was the translation good? Did they change a whole lot? What does it look like? And we call these text types. Now, as an aside, I'm sorry for getting into too much, but I think this is important. Listen to me here, okay? You probably understand that there are different versions of the Bible. I'm reading, as I said, the Message. Now, if I was to compare ESV to the Message in the Old Testament, it would be much different. The Message would basically be the same because he interprets it, and then I look here and I say, yeah, he interpreted that correctly, or I get some insights from it. But the message would be the same. Like whenever you get to, the parting of the Red Sea, he says the Red Sea was parted. They say the Red Sea was parted. He just uses more paraphrase, more idioms that I would be familiar with today. But again, that's a text type. The message is a text type. It's a paraphrase. Keep that word in. Text type. Text type. Whenever we're talking about the text of the Bible, that is one of the words we use whenever we're checking out manuscripts. This is a text type, the ESV. It tries to be a little bit more elegant and tries to be closer to word for word. Now, there's no translations that can actually stay word for word outside of what's called an interlinear. An interlinear actually has the Greek or the Hebrew word right underneath it, the English word. And if you tried to read that, it would be so clumsy in some areas that you wouldn't understand it. You'd be able to get a bunch of it. Eventually, you'd probably get it all, but we don't translate word for word anywhere. Even in the most faithful to the original text, and I got to be careful with that because I don't mean better, but like the New American Standard, it's very stilted. Some places are hard to read, but it's very close to the original as far as being word for word, if that's what you're looking for. If I was as somebody was going to say, hey, I want a word for word, what should I get? Or if they were to say, hey, I want to memorize the Bible, what should I memorize? Whenever I'm talking about certain passages, I usually say memorize a text type that is more like the New American Standard. Even the King James, to some degree, it's elegant, but it's not based upon the best manuscripts. NIV kind of hits right in the middle. The NIV is not paraphrased like the Message, which is paragraph for paragraph, using modern day idioms, that kind of stuff. Like if he's saying go fast, he might say step on it. I don't know if he'd use that idiom, but something like that, if you get what I'm saying. They would not have said step on it at this time or at the time of the Bible. They had different idioms, but he would translate them in such a way. The NIV is right in the middle. Just think of it as you've got the New American Standard and you've got the Message and then you got NIV, and all along the spectrum you've got different text types. That's why I'm going through this again. I want you to understand the word text type, okay? Because it's so important for what we're talking about. Now, having said that, whenever you go to what we have been using for the Old Testament, Codex Leningradus, we have known that text type for a long time. Why? Because that's a primary one we use. It's the most used one. It's the one we think is most faithful. It's the one we think is most word for word to the Hebrew. So we just go ahead and use it. We have some other ones here and there, but we don't have anything like we found at the Dead Sea. When we found that big Isaiah scroll, it was so incredibly important, because think of it. Whenever you're talking about Isaiah, here's the significance. Whenever you're talking about Isaiah, you have just found, if I was to find this, right? If I was the one who found it, you know what I'd do? I would open it up as fast as I could and turn where? Isaiah 53. I'd go straight to Isaiah 53 because it has the great prophecy about Christ that is so incredibly particular that there's not anybody that can read that and say, I mean, you read that today, I don't care who you are. If it's the first time you've read it, you would say, God, this is a passage about Jesus. This just tells the story of Jesus. This is just what Christians teach. This is just what the Bible teaches about Jesus. That's what you would say. And you may not know that that was from the Old Testament, and that was that we have a manuscript that we found at the Dead Sea, this great Isaiah. Many of these Isaiah manuscripts, but the great Isaiah manuscript we found that dates back 200 years before Christ. Now, Isaiah, we believe, wrote it 700 years before Christ. However, to find a manuscript that dates back before Christ 200 years, there's no possible way anybody can say we wrote Isaiah 53 after the fact. Isaiah 53 is incredibly particular. Pick it up and read it if you don't know what I'm talking about. Memorize Isaiah 53 is the first passage that I had my daughter memorize. But in Isaiah 53, it says, who has believed our report? To whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? And it starts talking about Christ. And he says, surely he bore our grief, and he carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten of God. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him the chastisement that brought peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All of us like sheep have gone astray, every one of us his own way. But the Lord has caused the sin of us all to come upon him. He was cut off from the land of the living. He was with robbers. He was with transgressors at his death. Whenever he hung next to two transgressors. He was buried in a rich man's tomb. It says he was with a rich man at his death. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He was put to grief. That is just such an incredible. And he was cut off from the land of the living. But it says the Lord would not allow his Holy One to undergo decay. I'm opening straight to that passage, and I'm reading it, and I am excited. And I'm saying, okay, this will automatically prove that Christ was the Messiah. It gives such strong evidence. It is the most important passage in possibly all the Bible because it's so affirming in so many ways. It gives us such deep theology. It gives us an understanding of the substitution that Christ gave on the cross. Even though we have it in the New Testament, right here in this one passage in Isaiah 53, it's everything. It's the gospel. It's the complete story of Christ. All that we need to know in order to have life, in order to be reconciled to God. That's why I'm turning to this passage. That's why it is my primary concern. And so here's the deal. We had that passage. It was opened up. They looked at it. Okay. Now let me go back to Joe Rogan for a minute. And here's the problem. Here's what happened whenever Wesley Huff was talking to Joe Rogan. They were at this point in the interview, and he was excited about it, just like I am, right? Very excited about it. He was just talking about the manuscript, and he said, yep, we found a manuscript. Isaiah, we found an entire Isaiah scroll. And not only did it date back 200 years before Christ, he said it was word for word. And Joe Rogan said, what, word for word? He was really interested. He wasn't biting just because he said word for word, but he kind of leaned in a little bit more. He said, really, word for word? Because that would be quite surprising. And Wesley Huff said, word for word. Now, gosh, unfortunately, I just wish, and whenever I was listening to it, I was like, oh my gosh. I mean, he's overstating the case, but I guess he's just excited. And I guess there's a way in which I could see him saying word for word. That would make sense, kind of in a paraphrase type thing. But to me, it was like, oh my God, there's so many people listening to this, and there's going to be a critique of this, and you are a legitimate scholar. Why did you say word for word? And I think he got overexcited. And so the problem is it's not word for word. If I found that Isaiah scroll, I would look at it and I'd be looking to see how close it matches Codex Leningradus, right? Now, we go back to the Bible translations, the Message, the NIV, the New Living Translation, the New American Standard, the NET, all kinds of translations that we have. Act like you have them sitting out in front of you, okay? The different paraphrases, you just have 20, 30 Bibles sitting out in front of you. Whenever you look at these, you could divide them. You could divide them into what's called text types. So I would put the NIV and the ESV and the New Living the Living Translation. I would put all of these in a particular text type called dynamic equivalence, dynamic equivalence. That'd be the best place to put them. So it's a text type. They're not trying to say paraphrase, and they're not trying to be word for word, but they're right there in the middle. That's a text type kind of. I'd say there's the ESV text type. There's the New American Standard text type, and then there's the Message text type. They're all the same Bible. They're all worthy to be read. They all have the same Christian message, and I'm excited if anybody comes to know Christ through any of them. Some of them I prefer for certain times, but at the same time, I'm not going to fight. I'm not going to say, oh my gosh, you got saved off this text type. That text type is completely off because the Message is just paraphrase. It's just paragraph for paragraph they translate. You need to get saved off a word for word. No, because it's the Message that's the most important thing. Do you get what I'm saying here? Okay, so text type. Now, if you could come with me, please, I'm sorry, this is a whole lot, but come with me to, let's say, after the apostles died and until the invention of the printing press. There are different kinds of scribes. Okay, there's pastors. Not everybody has a Bible, right? Because it's hard to do it. I mean, who's going to copy the whole thing for you? I mean, you got to use your pen, your hand. I mean, I'm left-handed, and my hand would rub over everything and just smear it. I would never be able to have a Bible. All growing up, I got F's on everything that had to do with either penmanship or just you had to write. So pretty much F's on everything. So I got a .33 whenever I was in 7th grade. That's the reason why, Lindsay. But anyway, I really would. And I mean, those of you who are left-handed know what I'm talking about. Just total and complete ink or pencil lead all over your hand. But that would be hard. And I mean, anybody, you'd have to, in order to, and I had to do this quite a bit. If you got in trouble in school, you had to write sentences, right? Either on the board or on a piece of paper. I had to write sentences quite a bit. I was not a great student. I was not a great kid. I admit to that. But I could never, ever imagine doing the entire Bible. Who would do this for you? Now, there were some people that were very rich. There were some churches that could get together and pull this off, but not many people had a translation of the Bible. Nevertheless, there were Bibles being transmitted at the time. Get the book of Romans and transmit it. Paul tells them to pass these letters around. They would copy them and then pass them to the next church. So spurious or invariably, eventually, many people had Bibles, but not everybody had a Bible. So you'd have churches and people with money. Constantine in the Eusebius tells us that Constantine in the 3rd or 4th century commissioned 50 full Bibles. So you had the president of the world, the emperor of the world, coming in and saying, President Trump just became president again. He's doing all these presidential acts that are big and significant. And this would be an act that Constantine did. I want 50 Bibles transmitted to our language or put together. They were already in the language, but put it together. And so that's where we probably got Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, because they all date to the same time and they seem to be kind of the same. Now, having said all that, you have all these different types of people transmitting. If they got that, you may hire it out. Listen, think about hiring out somebody. So think if you're super rich and you go out to hire, who's the best at being accurate whenever it comes to transmitting. Oh, that's old Bob down here on 5th Street. Go there, go to him. Everybody says he's the best. All right, you go to Bob. You say, Bob, tell me why you're the best. And he says, because I just do it word or letter for letter. And I have somebody check it. And you have all those little checks and balances in the way. And eventually you say, yeah, let me do it for me, please. But somebody else goes to somebody else and they say, hey, you're the only one in town who can write. Can you transmit this Bible? But this particular guy is a Christian who loves the Lord. And he knows a lot about the Bible. And so whenever he's transmitting, he may be in his mind trying to be accurate, but at the same time, accuracy is more important for word. So he finds something that he feels like maybe isn't accurate, and so he updates it, changes it. That's what he's saying in his mind. I know the scribe must have messed up here, so I'm changing this. If there were 2 angels at the tomb in this one, but 3 angels at the tomb, or 1 angel at the tomb at this one, then I'm going to add an angel on this one. They're just updating a little bit, massaging the text theologically or apologetically, because they're trying to, in their mind, make it accurate according to what they think they know. This guy over here that's hired, he don't care. He's just letter for letter. He doesn't care if there seems to be mess ups. I'll either transmit the mess up, or I'll transmit a corrected version with something above it that would say this is what the original said. We have tons of that. We have tons and tons of that kind of stuff. But we also have these people over here who are like, man, nobody's going to understand this. I mean, this was a few hundred years ago, and some of these words are just outdated. So I'm going to create a 4th century, a 5th century version of the message. I'm gonna translate it paragraph for paragraph, right? And so he does a paraphrase. So you got that, and just like we have, whenever we put all the Bibles on the table, you have all kinds of different versions. That's what we call them, but they're all different kinds of text types, right? Message text type, Phillips translation text type, all kind of very, very paraphrase. The Living Translation, more of a paraphrase. New Living, kind of in the middle. NIV, again, these are different text types. Do you get what I'm saying? There's different types of people. They're not trying to be unfaithful. They're not trying to make mistakes, but we find them. We find tons of them. Between all of these Bibles sitting on our table right now, all of my Bibles, my stack of Bibles that I have, whenever you go to Bible Hub and you look up a verse and it has 15, 20, sometimes like 50 different versions, and you look at them all, and they all say basically the same thing, but just in little but different ways, right? Think of those as kind of text types as well. Not the exact same whenever you have that many, but those are basically what I'm trying to say, text types. Whenever you look at the manuscripts of the New Testament and the Old Testament that we have, of course, both, that we have throughout history, we have a table full of them as well. And there's lots and lots of differences. It's exactly what you would expect. You wouldn't expect them to all be the exact same. People have different purposes whenever they're transmitting it. You're going to have message versions. You're going to have updates. You're going to have people who make changes. Now, we want the people who don't make the changes, and we've got a discipline, in scholarship called textual criticism, and it's incredible. Studying text criticism is so much fun, and it's so incredibly faith building. It really is. But it usually doesn't work out the way people think, because most people think, oh, you're saying you find the doctrine of preservation, that God inspired, you found one that God actually inspired throughout the time. Oh, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying we can be incredibly confident. In a very real sense, the differences help us in 2 ways. Number one, they help us because we know that they represent the original somewhere, and in basic form, these different words used for the same thing, they mean something very, very similar, and that we can eventually find it based upon comparing texts, comparing how early the text is, comparing how they compare to something else. Why would somebody change something? What's the best explanation for the variant or the change? That's what we do, and it's incredibly faith-building because we get so close to the original. Do we ever know if we get to the original? No, we won't. But it's such small things that changes the message not one bit. But another thing that's encouraging about this, listen to this. Another thing that is very encouraging is we have so many different manuscripts. We are not trying to, as Christians, as scholars who are looking back upon all the manuscripts, and as even those who are transmitting the Bible themselves, they're trying to transmit it as faithfully as they can, whether in word for word or in message. They don't care about faking people out. They're not thinking, oh my gosh, you know what? If we have a version called the Message and a version called New American Standard and a version called the NIV, people are going to think they're wrong because there's 3 different versions and say which version is right. That is not the way we think, because we're trying to transmit the message. And they don't care about the differences. They don't correct all. I mean, some of them every once in a while. Then we have that text type, but we have those type of people. But we're not. That is not what we do. Now, compared to say the Quran, if you see the Quran, they're always trying to burn all their different text types. If there's 4 or 10 or 12 different versions on the desk, they're going to burn 11 of them. They're going to burn 3 of them. They just want one so that whenever we hand it over, it's perfect. They believe in the doctrine of preservation. We do not. We do not need the doctrine of preservation in order for our faith to be true. Nobody should, because it's the message. The doctrine of preservation doesn't have to perfectly say, word for word, that Christ rose from the grave. There's a lot of different ways that can be said. Or that God loves us. Or that we are to trust in Him for our redemption. Or that He provided a way and that eventually He's going to come back and get us and take us to Himself. Now, we have lots of different text types. We have a pastor text type. We have a word-for-word text type. We have a faithful Christian who is an apologist. We have somebody who is a hired hand. We know that. When we look at these guys, we say, oh, this guy's a hired hand. We can tell. You get so good at textual criticism, you can tell all of these different things, right? This guy right here, he was interesting. He used the nomina sacra quite often in ways we would not think, and that is the name of God. He would put a line above things that he believed were sacred names, and the things that he put a line above were very interesting, including 616. So you can either say, well, that guy is satanic translating that, or there's something going on. But we find all kinds of quirky characteristics in the different manuscripts. Now, why am I saying all this? Because I want you to understand text type. That's what I want you to understand. I want you to understand there's different versions out there. Do you get that? Now, if you get that, here's what we do. We don't overstate our apologetics. We don't need word for word. Again, Wesley Huff just seemed to be excited. Here's what we do. We found that shepherd boy brought out these manuscripts. We have the great Isaiah manuscript. I'm running in, I'm checking what? I'm checking how close it is to the original, but you know what I want to know? Listen, do you know what I want to know? I want to know which text type that is. Which version? Is it a new one? Does it mirror the message? If it does, that's not that great because the message is paraphrased. Love the message, but it's not that great for a textual critic. We're trying to get as close to word for word. We want one of those hired hands or very, very faithful people. And with Leningradus, the one we've been using for years and years and years and still use whenever we're transmitting the Old Testament, we just use Leningradus. We need to update that a little bit because we need a more eclectic version. That's a whole different story. Listen to this, okay? We open up that Isaiah scroll, and basically, you've got Leningradus. Let's say the Leningradus is an ESV. English Standard Version. And we have this gap that is bridged of 1,200 years. Or no, about 1,100 years. Maybe 1,200 years. So Leningrad was 800 to 900 AD, and then we have these texts that are dated 200 years before Christ, at least. So this bridge that we have all of a sudden, and we look at it, and the ESV is the Leningrad, and guess what? This one is an ESV. Do you get what I'm saying? It was the same text type, which was incredible because we had already thought this text type was really, really good. That's why we've been using it. It seemed like it was very faithful. It seemed like it had the characteristics of somebody that is leaving problems in whenever they're there, that is not trying to, that does not have this smoothing over the person's characteristics through all the books, that all the books change in their characteristics because they were written by different people. And we liked Leningrad, and we used it. And then whenever we look back, here's what was crazy, and here's what was hard to believe, that there was Leningrad. Now, was it word for word? No, of course not. It wasn't word for word. But listen to this. It was text type for text type. Even though there were differences, and it was very, very close, even more close than text types are today, like between, say, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, both Alexandrian text type, but they are different, but they're the same text type. So whenever we're looking back at this, we see the text type. It is very, very close. It was the same type of person who had this. That's what we're trying to find. We're trying to find a lineage of this kind of, this particular aspect of the DNA. And we found it all the way back in the Isaiah scroll, which basically tells us, this is what it tells us, is although we did believe this was accurate, and although we feel like we could defend it, now we can really defend it. And we can say, golly, we do have the text type that is correct. We don't need word for word. We're never going to need word for word. We're always going to keep on searching for manuscripts and being excited about it, but we never, ever need the doctrine of preservation. So when we look back at this great Isaiah scroll, we are still so incredibly excited because it is the text type we hoped it would be. And it had Isaiah 53 in the same text type we hoped it would be. If it would have been a different text type, it still would have been great. If it would have been an NIV, it still would have been great. Would have been great even if it was the Message. In all the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have lots of different text types. We do have new text types that we've never seen before. Paraphrases that we've never seen before. They are still incredibly valuable. Just like I'm reading through the Message right now. And it is the most loose translation I've ever read. But I love it. I'm getting stuff out of it. If I have questions about it, I'll go back to a more stable translation, or go back to the Hebrew. We have just an embarrassment of riches here. But we didn't, we were just hoping back then. That is the thing that I wish probably Wesley, he was probably, since he was talking to Joe Rogan doesn't know anything about this. So in a sense, I can see him saying word for word. Maybe not repeating it, but I can see him saying that. Now, having said that, that's where the criticism came in. And after he said word for word, people checked it out just like they're going to. And a guy named Alex O'Connor, who is a very, very big online atheist, did a criticism of it, said, this is not word for word. I talked to this guy. I looked it up. Here's what it said. And then eventually, Wesley Huff came on and corrected himself. But whenever he corrected himself, I don't know whether it was right or not. I'm not an Old Testament textual critic. However, I was always having this red flag that say, I don't think it's word for word. I've never heard anything. I mean, I knew it wasn't word for word, but I thought, I don't even think it's that. It's the right text type. Just tell them what I told them. Maybe that's his way of doing it. Text type for text type. That's what I thought. Because how do you explain everything I just explained? I mean, it's all really excited, and I'd probably be on Joe Rogan saying all this stuff because it's so cool. Probably have all these Bible, it's It is so cool going through textual criticism. I know he knows what he's talking about. So he probably should have said it is text type for text type. Then it would be true and it would work. Now that he seemingly overstated his case, unfortunately, that's all anybody's criticizing. They're not seeing that we got the right text type. Who cares if they got a word wrong here or there? Who cares if there's even 2,000 differences? There is, between this and the Message, every word is different. I mean, there might be one or two words that are the same, but the Message is the exact same. That's the deal. People are missing the big picture. We have here we were to 5, 10, 15 million people. That's Joe Rogan's audience. And here we have the message. Now, thankfully, the message was proclaimed. I trust God with it, hand it over. But at the same time, it is that many people who are looking at this, and now they're seeing the correction. Online people are criticizing him. I think he's kind of stumbling around and trying to correct himself. Love the guy. I really do. First time I've ever seen him. Don't get me wrong at all. But I feel like it just needs to back up and say, hey, listen, you're missing the big picture. I don't care. I shouldn't have said text for word. I should have just said text for text. I'll explain it to you if you want me to have you on your show, Alex Rogan, or Alex O'Connor. That's what he should say. And then he can come on there and explain it all and have a second time of telling the gospel, and everybody would get it. But since we're trying to defend this word for word statement, we're missing it all. We're missing that the message is there. The Bible was preserved. And we're missing, most importantly, Isaiah 53. Let me read to you Isaiah 53 real quick. And say maybe, let me read to you Isaiah 53 from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And let me read to you Isaiah 53 from Leningrad. Now, there'd be a few differences here, but he could illustrate it that way. The whole world hear that. I mean, just to be incredible, seeing the exact same things being said, just slightly different way. And everybody's saying that's talking about Jesus. And he says, no, it's 200 years before Christ that we have this manuscript. And the book was written 700 years before Christ. How do you do this? The Nostradamus has nothing on this. There's not a person on the planet that I have ever seen that has anything even close to this kind of prophecy. And it coincides with so much other prophecies of the Old Testament, revelation of the Old Testament. So we look at it and we say, not only is it a miraculous prophecy, but it coincides with everything we believe before it and after. Therefore, this is from God, because I have absolutely no way to explain how on earth this guy, 200 years before Christ at least, 700 years before Christ if Christians are right, knew all this stuff was coming about Christ. I can't even say it was a self-fulfillment, because you wouldn't really get it. It's nuanced just enough to where it had to happen, and then you had to see it afterwards. It's incredible. Anyway, guys, here's why I did this, because I know some of you guys that follow me, because I talk to people who doubt a lot, this could trigger something. It should never trigger anything. I hope for everybody it just triggers a love and a desire to dig deeper into all of this stuff, because you're not going to go anywhere. But as long as you're studying the right people, you can't go anywhere but to the message of Christ and say, hey, I don't have anything to do. I don't have any way to move forward outside of falling down on my knees and saying, you are the Christ. You are the Son of the living God. Okay, guys, thank you for listening to this. I will get back to Through Theology in a year. Do not forget that one other thing right here. First of all, please support me if you believe in what I'm doing. Patreon.com/C Michael Patton. It is /C Michael Patton for everything, whether it's Facebook or anything else. Also, let's see here. Let's do the through the fathers right here. If you wanted to go through the church fathers with us, notice here you have something that I'm trying to show you. Through the church fathers in a year. This is, if you go to throughthechurchfathers.com, through thechurchfathers.com, you will find a website that is devoted to us reading through, just like you read through the entire Bible, this one is reading through the church fathers in a year. Also, one other thing, if you were wanting to check these out, these manuscripts, go to credocourses.com. I have it written all down there at the bottom. I thank you guys for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Theology